Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 441. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot of news to get through on today's show, talking about the offensive in Ukraine and all the new weapons that may be headed to Ukraine in the coming weeks as the U.S. looks to ramp up its support for Kiev. So be sure to share today's show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We will repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. It's up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee, and it's out anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. With the video version, I do, display the articles that I'm talking about, so some people find that helpful. Some of the articles includes maps and things like that, but for people who just listen to audio only, I don't think they miss too much of the content. So everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. If you can, share the show. If you're new, just subscribe. That way you don't miss an episode. And let's get into the news today. First story up here is Ukraine's top general says he needs more Western arms for counteroffensive. Even though the U.S. and its NATO allies have provided a massive amount of arms to Ukraine, the country's commander-in-chief says he needs more for Ukraine's armed forces to advance more rapidly in their counteroffensive. In an interview with the Washington Post, the general said he was frustrated because Ukraine's Western backers would never launch a major counteroffensive without air superiority and complained about the lack of modern fighter jets. He went on to say that Ukrainian forces should be able to fire as many artillery rounds as their enemy on the battlefield, but in some cases, Russia has fired 10 times as much artillery as Ukraine. He said that because of these reasons, Western comments about the counteroffensive being off to a slow start, and this is a quote from him, pisses me off. Western officials recently told CNN that the counteroffensive was not meeting expectations, and Ukrainian President Zelensky said the assault was going slower than desired. This is not a show, he said. It is a show it's not a show the whole world is watching and betting on or anything. Every day, every meter is given by blood. Without being fully supplied, these plans are not feasible at all, but they are being carried out, yes, maybe not as fast as participants in the show, the observers would like, but that's their problem. And so this is really interesting, right, that you had this general, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief of the army, is basically chastising the West for treating this conflict much the way that the anti-interventionists in the U.S. have been characterizing it, where basically the West sees this as an ability to harm Russia without spilling any blood from their own soldiers, and he's chastising them for watching at home, and this is just a show to them, a game to them, but in reality that every inch of soil that's taken or lost is, spilling Ukrainian blood, either by, Russians taking it or during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Just so many people are dying, trying to take a little bit of territory left. I've seen casualty figures for the past probably month now, because I think the somewhat official start date of the counteroffensive was June 4th, at around 10,000 Ukrainians. So that's a substantial number. The general went on to say that he has been expressing his concerns to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. We have an agreement 24/7. We're in touch. Sometimes I can call up and say, if I don't get 1,000 shells in a week, 100,000 shells in a week, 1,000 people will die. Step into my shoes. So, this is interesting. And then the demand, of course, for the F-16s, this is kind of crazy, right? Because we have this admission from the Ukrainian general that they really need these weapons and that they can't really have a successful counteroffensive without these weapons. And yet they're going ahead with the counteroffensive anyways, even though we know, I think the earliest that we're looking at is this coming spring 24, for these F-16s actually reaching the battlefield. So it'll probably be a counteroffensive a year from now, that maybe these F-16s are in the hands of Kiev and that their pilots are able to fly some sorties and carry out some level of air support for the offensive. But yet, they're probably going to push forward with this and see, tens of thousands of more Ukrainians die trying to take this territory that their own commander in chief says they don't have the weaponry to reconquer. Now, I should put a note here that, of course, it's this guy's job to, I guess I don't want to say it's his job to catastrophize, because at times it's probably his job to, say, oh, look how well the Ukrainian military is doing. Look how much territory we've retaken. Look how many Russians that we're killing. But, his job is propaganda in the public sphere. And part of that propaganda is generating more weapons coming from the West. And so, these messages are targeted in trying to get Western officials to give Ukraine more weapons. We have seen, finally, I guess, some, a little bit chafing from the American side or the Western side on this, kind of feeling that we've given tens of billions of dollars in weapons, and the fact that Ukraine is saying it's not enough, we need more. I think there's a lot of fairness and truth to that from the Ukrainian side, given how the Americans are using them as a proxy force. However, from being a Western taxpayer, I don't want any more of my money going to this. So, it's a difficult and nuanced argument and conversation to have. Next up here, let's talk about some of the weapons that the U.S. is considering giving Ukraine. Report U.S. close to approving long-range ATACMS for Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, June 19th. The U.S. is close to approving the provision of longer-range missiles for Ukraine that the White House has been reluctant to send due to concerns of escalation. The Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, have a range of up to 190 miles and can be fired from U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems. The ATACMS will more than double Ukraine's strike range and could be used to hit targets inside Crimea and in the Russian mainland. Most of the ammunition Kiev has for the HIMARS has a range of about 50 miles, although the U.S. has pledged some ground-launched small diameter bombs, which can be used to hit targets up to 94 miles away. Russia said in March it had downed a GLSDB for the first time. U.S. and European officials told the Wall Street Journal that the decision to send ATACMS is pending approval at the highest levels of the U.S. government. The report said that U.S. officials have seen signs that previously reluctant quarters of the U.S. government, namely the White House, have come to see an urgent need to bolster Ukraine's fight in the coming weeks. And I think this goes back to the point I've been making about the war and the escalation of Western aid, that the escalation of Western aid is very deliberate to do two things. Not to provoke Russia to go too far, because if Russia launches a massive bombing campaign of Ukraine, well, I'm sure they don't want to see a lot of innocent Ukrainian civilians just die at the hands of a Russian bombing campaign. That is something that they're at least not trying to encourage. But also, that they escalate too far, Russia could just start taking, lots of shots with missiles and aircraft at Ukrainian decision makers, and maybe try to bring the war to an end that way, and really just lead to the implosion of the Ukrainian state. And so rather than doing that, rather than other Russian options for escalation, targeting infrastructure, things like that, really trying to hurt Kiev and the West, they want to be somewhat moderate in their escalations. At the same time, they want to make sure that Ukraine keeps fighting. And so they have this very delicate balance where if they weren't providing Ukraine with more and more advanced weapons, I think Ukraine would be negotiating with Moscow, ceding quite a bit of territory and bringing this war to an end. However, if there's constantly not only a flow of new weapons and more advanced weapons coming to Ukraine, but kind of the promise that it's going to have a little bit of addiction in Kiev's part, right? Like always anticipating what's the new weapon system coming, where are we going to get our hands on that? How is this going to change the battlefield? Probably makes it very hard for officials in Kiev to actually look at negotiation, because one day maybe America will finally give you the weapons that you feel that you need to take back a significant amount of your territory. So Back to Dave's article here. The officials cited Prigozhin's short-lived mutiny as a reason the U.S. should escalate military aid for Ukraine. Hawks in Congress have been arguing that the uprising is evidence that U.S. support for Kiev is working, and say it's reason to approve more spending on the war, which I don't think that should be the lesson from this, because that uprising, that insurrection, whatever you want to call it, certainly not a legitimate attempt that, really threatened Putin's power, I think kind of shows the hold that Putin has on power in Russia. And so I'm not sure, what they're saying is working by this example. When asked about the report, the Pentagon spokesperson, this is Brigadier General Pat Ryder, said, "I'm not aware of any intimate decisions as it relates to the ATACMS." Now, one thing I just want to mention here is apparently when the U.S. sent Ukraine the HIMARS launchers, they put in a component, some kind of something, I'm not sure, it wasn't very detailed what it was, to limit the munitions that could be fired from the HIMARS to the 50-mile range rockets, and not they wouldn't be able to support the ATACMS. So I'm guessing they put in some kind of piece of something that prevents these launchers from loading larger missiles or something like that. And so I'm not sure if American troops will have to be involved in removing those obstacles, or maybe those were only on earlier HIMARS launchers that were sent to Ukraine, and in recent months they've stopped, putting those additional parts and pieces on. But that is something that I think is worth thinking about, and that may cause some problems, or at least create some extra work for Washington. All right, next up, Connor Freeman, again, June 19th. Kiev in talks with Warsaw to purchase Naval Strike missile systems. Ukraine is negotiating with Warsaw to obtain Naval Strike missiles, NSM systems, which would give Kiev the ability to hit targets on land or sea from a distance of more than 124 miles. The possible deal comes as the U.S. and its allies are working to boost the longer range capabilities of Ukraine's armed forces. Early in the war, Washington provided Kiev with a somewhat similar Harpoon anti-ship missile launchers, but the NMSM system typically has a much greater range, although depending on the variants used, the Harpoons can have a range of up to 150 nautical miles. Defense 24, a Polish outlet, reported that the Ukrainians are considering whether to buy an entire NSM system or just various parts. As a part of the Coastal Missile Squadron, Poland has 2 NSM systems in operation. Each system is made up of 2 batteries with 3 missile launch vehicles, each of which carry 4 missiles. According to the Defense Post, the missiles are relatively lightweight and highly maneuverable. They also use composite materials for added stealth and ski skimming capabilities, and the use of autonomous targeting recognition. Warsaw became the first NSM operator to deploy coastal variant defense for defense, although the U.S. Marine Corps, Latvia, Romania have decided to produce the same version. In recent weeks and months, the NATO bloc has been working to enhance Ukraine's military with longer range capabilities. London began providing Ukraine with the air-launched Storm Shadow missiles, which can hit targets more than 155 miles away and a range exceeding any weapon systems the U.S. has yet provided. Yet these missiles can be fired by the MiG-29 warplanes. NATO members Slovenia and Poland have sent those planes to Ukraine. All right. And now this from July 2nd, Dave DeCamp again. Report U.S. close to providing Ukraine with widely banned cluster bombs. The U.S. is moving closer to sending widely banned cluster bombs to Ukraine as the Biden administration is pushing Congress to put aside concerns about harm munitions can do to civilians, the Washington Post reported on Sunday. And I've talked about this a lot on the show. There's a lot of desire in Congress to send these munitions. I think the U.S. has over 1 million of these rounds, these cluster rounds, and the U.S. has signed treaty. I believe the U.S. is. The U.S. may not have signed the cluster ban treaty, but there's a massive treaty that says that's signed by most of the countries in the world that says that you shouldn't use cluster weapons because the sub bomblets often don't explode, and then years later they're hit by farmers, driven over, picked up by children, and cause tens of thousands of deaths in the years to come. Now, cluster munitions have already been used by Russia and Ukraine on the battlefield. Turkey provided Ukraine with some cluster bombs, so I think this is going to happen. I do think that they're going to end up providing these cluster bombs to Ukraine. I think it's only a matter of time at this point. There's a lot of political momentum behind it. Now I want to move on to an article that I wrote yesterday that is July 2nd. Ukrainian forces are using outlawed mines. Human Rights Watch found that Ukrainian troops have been using scatter mines. The anti-personnel weapons are internationally banned, including by Kiev, because of their devastating impact on civilians. Human Rights Watch reports several instances where Ukraine used anti-personnel scatter mines. The Human Rights Monitoring Group first made allegations in January, but the press release issued on Friday says more evidence was recently found. The evidence shows Ukrainian forces fired rockets carrying thousands of PFM-1 anti-personnel mines, also called petal or butterfly mines. And for people watching, I have a picture of one I use for my story here, or anybody reading my article. And you can kind of see that this thing, they're either painted brown or green, so they kind of blend in with the ground. They almost look like some kind of firework, except obviously these are made of metal and not paper. And so, I'm sure they get picked up by children. I'm sure they get stepped on a lot. Human Rights Watch verified 11 civilian casualties from the mines, including one death and multiple amputations of lower legs, based on interviews with victims and their family members. Russia has also used anti-personnel weapons. However, unlike Moscow, Kiev has ratified an international treaty outlawing their use. The Ukrainian government responded to the Human Rights Watch report by saying it will study the claims, but maintains Kiev has the right to self-defense. Additionally, Washington is close to approving the transfer of cluster bombs to Ukraine. Like scatter mines, cluster bombs dropped submunitions, and they remain on the ground for well after the war ends, killing civilians for years to come. There is an international treaty on outlawing cluster bombs. However, the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine are not parties to that agreement. Both Moscow and Kiev have already used cluster bombs on the battlefield. So, yeah, that is right. The U.S., Russia, and Ukraine are all not parties to the cluster ban treaty. Or cluster bomb ban treaty. All right, last up here on the weapons front, we have Raytheon looking to get more help producing Stinger missiles. This by Dave DeCamp. Raytheon has called in retired engineers to help produce Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that the U.S. has been providing to Ukraine. Stingers are shoulder-fired missiles that were out of production for 20 years until the U.S. started sending them to Ukraine when Russia first invaded last year, a policy led by former Raytheon board member Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. has provided Ukraine with over 1,700 Stinger missile systems to date. Stingers have been out of production for 20 years, and all of a sudden, the first 48 hours of this war is the start of the show and everybody wants more, the president of Raytheon Missile and Defense said last week. Raytheon needs to produce more the Stingers using blueprints drawn up by the Carter administration and using more advanced production methods that would require redesigning the weapons. We're bringing back retired employees that are in their 70s to teach new employees how to actually build a Stinger, Kramer said. That's the president of Raytheon. We're pulling test equipment out of warehouses and blowing the spider webs off of them. The U.S. placed an order for Stingers in May of last year to replace the ones sent to Ukraine, but the Pentagon says they won't be delivered until 2026. Kramer said it will take at least 30 months for the first missiles to be completed due to the time it will take to restart production. And of course, the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is a former board member of Raytheon. All right, next up here, I wrote this for the antiwar.com on Friday. NATO to pledge future membership to Ukraine, but no timeline. Washington expects Kiev will receive a stronger commitment from the North Atlantic Alliance at an upcoming summit, an American official told reporters on Thursday. However, Ukraine will not be given a timeline on when it will receive membership in the alliance. U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, described the likely agreement that will be signed by alliance leaders during the meeting set for July 11th to 12th in Vilnius, Lithuania. Most of us feel confident that we will be able to come to an agreement that will reflect where we are and that the Ukrainians will believe and feel is something above and beyond restating Bucharest. In 2008, during a summit in Bucharest, NATO adopted a resolution stating that Ukraine and Georgia will one day join the alliance. The statement met a sharp rebuke from the Kremlin, which views NATO expansion into those countries as critical threats to Russia's national security. President Putin named NATO's deep military ties with Ukraine as one of his primary reasons he ordered the invasion of the country last year. For months, members of the North Atlantic Alliance had debated Ukraine's future within the bloc. Eastern European members, along with Kiev, seek to give Ukraine a concrete path to membership as well as a clear timeline for when it might be permitted to join. However, some in Western European states, as well as Washington, do not agree and prefer to focus on the war with Russia. Ukrainian President Zelensky has threatened to boycott the Vilnius summit if Kiev is not given a strong enough commitment. It is not clear if Kiev's demands will be sufficiently satisfied by the proposal Smith put forward. The statement will likely give Ukraine conditions for membership, but not a timeline for when it can actually join the bloc. All members appear to be in agreement on making a significant pledge to arm Ukraine for years into the future during this summit. The prevailing vision is to develop a military relationship with Kiev resembling Washington ties with Tel Aviv, dubbed the Israel model. And we talked about that quite a bit on the show. We also have this statement from the UK Defense Minister Ben Wallace saying that NATO should consider skipping a member action plan, a MAP, as a requirement for Ukraine to join the Western Military Alliance. And so maybe this is what Julianne Smith is talking about. Maybe she's, saying that, okay, we're not going to require them to take this step. We're going to go ahead and put it in writing that Ukraine doesn't have to do that. The map is designed to ensure aspiring NATO members meet certain political, economic, and military standards to join the alliance. Waiving the map would speed up Ukrainian membership if NATO ever formally invites Kiev to join. According to the UK Parliament, House of Commons Library, between 1990 and 2020, every new member joined through a map, but Finland and Sweden invited last year without having to go through the map process. Now, Sweden and Finland were, I think, essentially de facto NATO members. They had strong military ties, participate in all the Western war games. They sent representatives to all the NATO conferences, and so that's probably why. Now, Ukraine may have just as strong ties to NATO as this point, so that's something to consider, and maybe why Ben Wallace is making this argument that NATO, or Ukraine, is almost a de facto NATO member at this point. All right, guys, this is an important one, and we were on this show absolutely right all along. The balloon that flew over the United States was not a massive national security threat. In fact, it doesn't seem like it did much of anything at all. All right, Dave DeCamp wrote this up last week for antiwar.com. Pentagon says balloon did not collect data over the U.S. The Pentagon said Thursday that the Chinese balloon that wound up over the U.S. in February did not collect data while it flew over U.S. territory. We believe that it did not collect data while it was transiting the United States or flying over the United States, and certainly the efforts that we made contributed, I'm sure, said Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Pat Ryder. Ryder made the comments when asked by the Wall Street about a Wall Street Journal report that said the balloon contained U.S.-made equipment. I don't have any specifics to provide as it pertains to the People's Republic of China's high-altitude balloon and any potential U.S. components, he said. For their part, Beijing has said the balloon was a civilian research device, while the Biden administration says it was a surveillance device. At this point, it has become clear that China did not intend to fly the balloon over the U.S., something President Biden recently acknowledged. That wasn't supposed to be where it was going. It was blown off course up through Alaska, then down through the United States, Biden said. The balloon incident caused a frenzy in Washington, causing Secretary of State Antony Blinken to postpone a trip to China. Members of Congress demanded President Biden shoot down the balloon, which he eventually did when it was off the coast of South Carolina. Following the downing of a Chinese balloon, the U.S. downed 3 identified objects using four $400,000 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. At least one was likely a small hobby balloon known as a Pico balloon, which can be purchased for as little as $12 depending on the type. The White House has acknowledged that 3 objects could have been totally benign. President Biden said they were likely balloons tied to private companies' research, recreational or research institutions studying weather or conducting scientific research. And so this whole frenzy that captivated the entire nation, we have people calling for war, serious thought leaders in the United States calling for war over this, that this was a declaration of war by China. People were terrified of this balloon, right? That was somehow going to harm them. All kinds of absurd theories emerged that these were intentionally flying over American nuclear sites. And now it turns out that it wasn't even collecting data during that time. And who knows, it was probably loaded up with American-made components too. This is absolutely absurd. And we should all hold our mainstream media in so much contempt. And the Biden administration, our Secretary of State fed into this by canceling a planned trip to China that has been really caused a lot of deteriorating relationships between the U.S. and China. Completely ridiculous that all this happening. Again, we should be pissed as hell that they scared a lot of people. The war rhetoric with China really ramped up over this balloon, and it was all a fake threat. All an absolute fake threat. And look, now that that's coming out, is anybody making a big deal out of it other than us at antiwar.com and a few other independent media sites? Not at all. Because, telling people that, we scared you and you really don't need to be afraid isn't nearly as attention grabbing, isn't the narrative that the mainstream media wants to put out to us. It's just absolutely despicable. It makes me so sick. All right, couple more stories before we wrap up here. Taiwan's Thai thanks U.S. Congressional Delegation for increasing ties. Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen met with visiting U.S. Congressional Delegation in Taipei on Wednesday and thanked lawmakers for the steps the U.S. is taking to increase support for Taiwan. We thank the U.S. Congress consistently showing bipartisan concern for Taiwan's security and a show of support for Taiwan through concrete actions, Tsai told the delegation, according to the Taipei Times. The 9-person delegation was led by Representative Mike Rogers, a Republican from Alabama, chair of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressional visits to Taipei anger Beijing as China is opposed to official contacts between the U.S. and Taiwanese government, which it views as going against the U.S.'s and, the agreement that governs the U.S.-China relationship, and that's the One China policy. We firmly oppose any form of official interactions between the U.S. and Taiwanese authorities. All U.S. government bodies, including the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, should act on the foreign policy of the U.S. government affirmed and committed itself to, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said on Thursday. The visit came as the House Armed Services Committee approved the House's version of the $886 billion National Defense Authorization budget, which includes several provisions to increase military support for Taiwan. Tsai says she was thankful of the committee members' efforts to include policy measures in the annual renewal of the National Defense Authorization Act that enhance Taiwan's defensive capabilities. And of course, the issue here is that China, views Taiwan as a part of China. And so, imagine a situation where Hawaii found itself in a situation where, yes, they were still officially part of the U.S., but at the same time, they had their own independent government set up, and China was arming this government and sending high-level delegations to this government. I think obviously the Americans would see that as China encouraging Hawaii to be independent, a place that we would consider a part of America. And that's, kind of what's going on here, except Taiwan is far closer to China than the Hawaii is the U.S., of course. And I think historically, going back, has been part of China far longer than Hawaii has been part of the U.S. All right, last story here. State Department approves $440 million arms sale for Taiwan. The Biden administration last week approved 2 potential arms deals for Taiwan worth $440 million amid heightened tensions between the U.S. and China. According to the Pentagon's Defense Security and Cooperation Agency, DSCA, one deal is for 30 millimeter ammunition and related equipment worth $332 million, and the other sale is worth $108 million and will support the purchase of spare and repair parts for wheeled vehicles, weapons, and other related equipment of the Defense Support Program. So not exactly clear of, what equipment that is, but of course China will see it provocative, as that's another $500 million in weapons that the U.S. will be sending to Taiwan. Anyways, everyone, that is it for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And of course, I always really appreciate anybody who could just retweet the show, recommend it to somebody new, just do what you can to get it out there. We work hard to bring you shows every week. All the articles we're writing at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com. So the more you could help just by sharing that content and getting it out there to more people, the more it helps us out. And anyways, really appreciate it. And we'll be back with more shows later in the week.